There are two types of silence. The first is the peaceful, first sip of coffee on a Sunday morning kind of silence, the one that promises a day of blissful nothing. The second is the hollow, gut-punch silence you get when you step out onto your front porch and the two multi-ton, custom-outfitted disaster supply vans that are your pride and joy have vanished into thin air. This was the second kind. I stood there on my porch, a novelty mug that said, "I like my coffee black, like my soul," growing cold in my hand. My brain did a frantic, stumbling ballet, trying to reconcile the image in my head. My two beautiful, burly vans, Florence and Nightingale, parked right there on the street, with the empty stretch of asphalt mocking me in the morning sun. Did I park them somewhere else? No. I had a routine, a system. They were my girls. You don't just forget where you parked your children. Were they stolen? A cold spike of dread shot through me. I imagined them being stripped for parts in some grimy chop shop, my carefully catalogued medical supplies and water purifiers being traded for meth. The thought was so violating it almost made me drop my coffee. Then I saw it. A greasy, rain-smeared piece of paper was slapped onto my front door, held there by a piece of tape with all the adhesive strength of a Post-it note in a hurricane. I peeled it off. The company name at the top was Vulture Towing and Recovery, which felt a little on the nose. The reason for the tow was a single, cryptic line: violation of HOA Directive 11B. And underneath, in the space for authorizing party, was a single, elegantly looped name that made my blood run cold and hot at the same time. Carol, of course. It was always Carol. The self-appointed queen of our cul-de-sac, the president of the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association, a woman who wielded a rule book with the same righteous fury that a crusader wielded a sword. My 6-month Cold War with HOA Karen had just gone nuclear. 6 months earlier, I had been a hopeful idiot. I'd bought this house in Harmony Creek because it was quiet, the trees were mature, and it was close enough to the city for work, but far enough away that my blood pressure dropped 10 points on the drive home. I work from home as a data analyst, which gives me a lot of flexibility and, unfortunately, a front-row seat to the neighborhood's daily dramas. My real passion, though, was my little disaster relief project. A few years back, I'd been living down south when a hurricane decided to redecorate the entire state with extreme prejudice. I wasn't a first responder, just a guy with a 4x4 and a desire not to be useless. I saw communities completely cut off, neighbors helpless because they couldn't get clean water or basic first aid. The experience stuck to me like tar. So I started a project. It wasn't some doomsday prepper fantasy. I don't own a tinfoil hat or a bunker full of ammunition. This was a practical help thy neighbor initiative. I bought 2 used cargo vans and poured my weekends and a significant chunk of my savings into them. Florence was a sturdy Ford Transit, painted a sensible forest green. Her decals were neat and professional. Potable water, first aid, non-perishable food, communications gear. She was the nurturer. Nightingale was a beefier Ram ProMaster, slate gray, all business. Her decals read, Search and Rescue Equipment, Temporary Shelter, Power Generation. She was the muscle. They were my rolling monuments to preparedness, legally registered, fully insured, and parked on the public street right in front of my house. I'd even gone down to City Hall before I moved in. Checked the municipal codes. As long as a vehicle wasn't derelict, abandoned, or over a certain commercial weight class, which my vans were not, it could be parked on a public street for up to 72 hours at a time. I moved them every day. I was squeaky clean. I had failed, however, to account for the unwritten, invisible laws of Harmony Creek, which were enforced by its high priestess, Carol. I met her on my second day here. I was wrestling a flat-pack bookcase through my front door when she power-walked onto my lawn, her visor so white it was a hazard to aviation. "Good morning," she'd chirped, her voice having the pleasant cadence of a smoke alarm. "I'm Carol, the HOA president. Just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood and give you this." She handed me a 3-ring binder thick enough to stop a bullet. "It's our covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I'd advise you to read it thoroughly. We take community cohesion very seriously here." "Thanks," I'd said, grunting under the weight of Swedish-engineered particle board. "I'll add it to my light reading pile." She didn't crack a smile. "Page 47, Section D, subsection Lawn Maintenance. Grass height is not to exceed 3 inches. Yours is currently at 3 1/4. I'll give you a grace period since you're new." That was my introduction to Carol. The next few months were a series of gentle escalations. A note about my recycling bin being visible from the street for 3 hours past the designated collection time. An email about the shade of my welcome mat being thematically inconsistent with my front door. Then came the incident of Bartholomew the dandelion. I walked out one morning to find her on my lawn, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at a single defiant dandelion that had sprouted near my walkway. "Good morning, Leo," she'd said, the clipboard of judgment already in her hand. "That's a violation of Bylaw 7, Section C, subsection Noxious Weeds and Aesthetic Disruptions." "Good morning, Carol," I'd replied, trying to keep a straight face. "You mean this little guy? I was going to name him Bartholomew. I thought he added a certain rebellious charm to the place." "The covenants are clear," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Uniformity is the bedrock of property values. You have 24 hours to rectify the situation, or a fine of $25 will be issued." I plucked the dandelion later that day, feeling like I was betraying a comrade. My neighbor Dave, a chill guy with a dad bod and a healthy disdain for authority, saw the whole thing from his driveway where he was washing his SUV. "Gotcha, huh?" he'd called over, shaking his head. "You'd think I was cultivating plutonium in my petunias." "That's Karen, Carol for you," he'd corrected himself. "Last month she tried to fine me because my basketball hoop was casting a non-compliant shadow on her driveway. She said it disrupted the visual meridian of the cul-de-sac. I had to look that up. It's not a real thing." He'd paused, then lowered his voice. "Just a heads up, man. She's got a thing about vehicles. Hates them, especially ones that look useful. Her husband drives a tiny electric car that looks like a scared roller skate." Dave's warning proved prophetic. A week later, I got the first official-looking letter from the HOA. It was a courtesy warning about oversized commercial-type vehicles being parked on the street. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation, filled with vague, ominous language about maintaining the residential character of the community. It didn't actually cite a specific, broken rule. It just implied that my vans were hurting the neighborhood's feelings. I read the vehicle section of the bylaws cover to cover. The rules were about derelict cars, campers, and large commercial trucks. My girls were classified as standard Class 2 vans. They were cleaner than Carol's soul. I did what any sane person would do. I tossed the letter. Which brings us back to this morning. Standing on my porch, holding the greasy tow notice from Vulture Towing, I finally understood. The letters, the warnings, the dandelion execution, it was all a prelude. This was the main event, and I was furious. The air went out of my lungs. It wasn't just metal and tires. It was thousands of dollars of equipment. It was countless hours of my life. It was my passion. It was my girls. And they'd been abducted by a company literally named after a carrion bird. The rage started as a low hum in my chest, and quickly escalated to a full-blown internal Metallica concert. I balled my fists, the crinkling of the toe slip a pathetic sound in the sudden heavy silence. The war was on, and I had no intention of losing. My first call was to the vultures themselves. I furiously dialed the number on the slip, my thumb jabbing the screen of my phone. A woman with a voice that sounded utterly bored with the universe answered on the third ring. "Vulture Towing," she droned. "Yes, hello. You towed 2 of my vans this morning from an address in Harmony Creek," I said, my voice tight. "I want to know where they are and on what authority they were taken." "Address?" I gave it to her, my teeth grinding. I could hear the clacking of a keyboard, the sound of someone who was in no hurry whatsoever. "Yep, got it right here. 2 vans, a green Ford, and a gray Ram. Authorized by the Harmony Creek HOA. You can pick 'em up at our impound lot on Industrial Way. Gates close at 5. Wait. How much is this going to cost me?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. "Let me see." More clacking. "That'll be an $800 tow fee per vehicle, plus a $200 administrative fee per vehicle, plus the first day of storage, which is $75 per vehicle. So, lessee, $2,350. For now. Storage fees accrue daily." I felt my soul try to leave my body. $2,000? Are you kidding me? Who specifically from the HOA authorized this? "Says here, a Miss Carroll." "Of course it does," I muttered. "And what, exactly, is HOA Directive 11B? Because I've read the bylaws. It doesn't exist." "Sir, I just answer the phones. I dispatch the trucks and I tell people how much they owe. You want to dispute the tow, you take that up with your HOA. We take cash, Visa, or MasterCard. We do not take personal checks." Click. She hung up on me. For a moment, I just stood there, phone in hand, listening to the dial tone. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it all was breathtaking. This wasn't about a rule. This was a power play, a hit job. Carol had effectively stolen over $2,000 from me and held my property hostage. My next move was pure, unadulterated instinct. I stormed out of my house, strode across my lawn, carefully avoiding stepping on any potential dandelions, and marched right up to Carol's front door. Her lawn was, of course, immaculate. A small, professionally printed sign was staked near her perfectly edged walkway. It read, "Don't even think about parking here." I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and discreetly started a voice memo recording before I pounded on her door, louder than was strictly necessary. The door swung open, and there she was. Carol, dressed in a crisp pink tracksuit, a smug, triumphant smile playing on her lips. It was the smile of a chess player who had just said checkmate to a hamster. "Leo," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "To what do I owe the intensity?" "You towed my vans, Carol," I said, my voice low and shaking with barely controlled rage. "I didn't tow anything," she replied, waving a dismissive hand as if shooing away a fly. "The Homeowners Association, of which I am the duly elected president, acted to preserve the aesthetic and financial integrity of our community. Those trucks were an eyesore and a clear violation." "A violation of what?" "Show me the rule," I challenged, stepping closer. "Show me the specific line item in that binder you love so much that I broke." "It's a holistic interpretation of the covenants," she said, the buzzwords flowing effortlessly. "It's about community cohesion. They were clearly commercial in nature, regardless of their registration class. They were bringing down the tone of the neighborhood. People were talking." "You mean you were talking?" I shot back. "Those are my personal property, legally parked on a public street. You had no right to touch them." "I have every right," she snapped, her composure finally cracking. The smug mask slipped, revealing the petty tyrant beneath. It is my duty to protect our property values from elements like this. If you want them back, pay the fee. And I would strongly advise you not to bring them back here. Consider this your final warning." She tried to slam the door, but I put my foot in the way. "This isn't over, Carol, not by a long shot. Get your foot out of my door or I'm calling the police," she hissed. "Good, call them," I said, pulling my foot back. I was about to do the same. I turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. I stopped the recording. I had it. I had her admitting she authorized it, admitting it was based on her holistic interpretation and not a real rule. It was a start. Back in my house, I called the non-emergency police line. I felt a bit like a kid tattling on the playground, but this was grand larceny in my book. 20 minutes later, a cruiser idled to a stop at my curb. 2 officers got out. One was young, bright-eyed, with a name tag that read Evans. He looked like he still believed he could make a difference. The other was older, with a mustache that had seen things and a weary slump to his shoulders. His tag read Miller. He looked like he'd been running on black coffee and cynicism since the Reagan administration. I met them on the sidewalk and explained the entire situation as calmly and rationally as I could. I showed them the tow slip, the bogus Directive 11B, and told them about my confrontation with Carol. Officer Evans was taking vigorous notes in a little flip pad. "So she authorized a private tow company to seize your vehicles from a public street based on an internal HOA rule?" he asked, his brow furrowed with righteous indignation. "That doesn't seem right. That could be construed as wrongful seizure of property." Sergeant Miller just listened, his expression unchanging. Finally, he let out a deep, soul-weary sigh. It was the sigh of a man who had seen the absurd, ugly underbelly of suburbia one too many times. "Son," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble, "let me introduce you to the Bermuda Triangle of law enforcement, the HOA dispute. It's a place where logic goes to die." He turned his gaze from Evans to me. "Look, I get it. I really do. I wouldn't want to live next to her either. But from where we're standing, your vehicle wasn't technically stolen in the criminal sense. It was towed. Illegally? Maybe. Probably. But the authorization came from an organization, the HOA, which makes it a civil matter." My heart sank. "So you can't do anything?" "We can't arrest her for being a power-tripping menace. No, as much as we'd sometimes like to," Miller said. "The DA would laugh it out of the courtroom. Our hands are tied. We can file a report for you, which I recommend you do. You can use that report when you sue her and the HOA in small claims court. It's a headache, but from what you've told me, you'd win." Just then, as if summoned by the mere mention of her name, Carol strutted out of her house, clipboard in hand, a look of stern disapproval on her face. She was clearly marching over to give the officers a piece of her mind about them idling and creating a disturbance. Miller saw her coming and held up a hand, a gesture that stopped her dead in her tracks at the edge of her lawn. He turned back to me and leaned in conspiratorially, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "Listen, kid, I didn't say this. You get me?" I nodded. "You're paying your taxes. You're parking legally on a public street. She's the one playing games in a gray area. With these types, you don't fight them in the mud. They like the mud. They live there. You gotta fight them with the one thing they understand and fear more than anything. Bureaucracy from a higher power." He straightened up, his professional mask back in place. "Find the rule that trumps her little rule book. There's always one. A city ordinance, a county code, a state statute. Fight her paperwork with better, stronger paperwork." Sergeant Miller gave me a slow, deliberate wink. Then he turned, gave Carol a curt nod, and got back in his car. As they drove away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk, a new sense of purpose began to bloom in my chest, pushing aside the helpless rage. The war wasn't going to be won with shouting matches on a doorstep. It was going to be won with paper cuts. The anger had now cooled from a roaring bonfire into a simmering, focused laser. My living room, once a place of relaxation, transformed into a command center. I commandeered the dining table, covering it with my laptop, a legal pad, and enough printouts to deforest a small country. I brewed a pot of coffee so strong it could probably dissolve steel. This was my war room. My mission, as Sergeant Miller had so wisely advised, was to find a bigger fish. Carol was the shark of our little cul-de-sac pond, but every pond flows into a bigger river. I needed to find a bureaucratic great white. I started with the Harmony Creek HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I read all 200 soul-crushing pages of it. I read about approved mailbox colors, the precise angle at which a satellite dish could be mounted, and the designated hours for joyful noise. It was a tyrannical document, but in its vehicle section, I found only what I already knew: rules about derelict cars, RVs parked for more than 72 hours, and large-scale commercial vehicles like semi-trucks. My vans fit none of these descriptions. Carol's Directive 11B was a complete fabrication. Next, I dove into the city's public website. I waded through pages of ordinances, my eyes glazing over. Parking regulations, towing laws, public nuisance codes. I was highlighting sections, cross-referencing them, muttering to myself like a madman. After 3 hours and half a pot of coffee, I had confirmed what I already knew. I was 100% in the right, according to city law, but that didn't get my vans back without a lengthy court battle. I needed more. I needed a nuke. Dejected, I took a break from the legal texts and had an idea. It was an idea born of pure, unadulterated spite. I couldn't win the war on the vans just yet, but I could open up a new front. I could engage in a little malicious compliance. I pulled up the HOA rulebook again and scrolled to the section on lawn and garden ornaments. It was surprisingly vague. It specified a maximum height of 4 feet and forbade anything that produced noise or light. There was nothing about taste, nothing about quantity. A wicked, beautiful, terrible idea began to form in my mind. I Googled local landscapers and found a company with a refreshingly no-nonsense name, Frank's Flawless Fencing and Landscaping. I dialed the number. A voice that sounded like it was filtered through gravel and unfiltered cigarettes answered. Frank's. Hi, I said. I'm looking to get a quote on a project. It's a bit unusual. It involves gnomes. There was a long pause on the other end. I could almost hear the man mentally evaluating if this was a prank call. How many gnomes are we talking about? Frank finally asked. A legion, I said, warming to the theme. Enough to be seen from space. I want a gnome village, no, a gnome metropolis. I want gnomes fishing in a tiny custom-dug pond. I want gnome construction workers building a tiny gnome skyscraper. I want a gnome biker gang with little leather vests parked in front of a gnome dive bar. All under 4 feet tall, of course, and silent. Very, very silent. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, a slow chuckle rumbled through the phone. Son, where do you live? An hour later, Frank himself was standing on my lawn. He was a big, burly guy in his 50s with a cynical smile and hands like catcher's mitts. I gave him the short version of my war with Carol. When I got to the part about the vans being towed, Frank threw his head back and let out a deep, booming belly laugh that startled a flock of birds from a nearby tree. Oh man, an HOA war, he roared, slapping his thigh. I love these. It's the last pure form of combat left in this country. I had a guy once over in Pinewood Estates. The HOA told him he couldn't have a blue fence. Rules said it had to be earth tones. So we found the ugliest color in the swatch book, a shade of green, that looked like baby vomit and painted the whole damn thing. It was technically an earth tone. The HOA president, a real piece of work, had to look at it every morning from her kitchen window. She moved a year later. He looked from me to Carol's house and then back again, a conspiratorial gleam in his eye. So, you want a gnome army to lay psychological siege to the local dictator? Son, I'll do this one for cost. Consider it a public service. It's good for my soul. Frank, it turned out, was a savant of malicious compliance. He became my enthusiastic co-conspirator, sketching out ideas on his notepad with a stubby pencil. We can put a gnome queen on a throne, make it look just like her, he suggested. And see this big oak tree? We put a gnome oracle in there, have him pointing right at her house. We can get really weird with it. We spent a delightful 45 minutes plotting the downfall of Carol's sanity through strategic gnome placement. After Frank left, I felt energized. I returned to my war room, ready to dive back into the digital trenches. I decided to take a different approach. Instead of looking for rules I hadn't broken, I started looking for rules that Carol might have broken. I went to the neighborhood's public social media page, a place I usually avoided like the plague. It was mostly just lost cat photos and arguments about politics. I scrolled back through weeks of posts. And then I saw it. It was a brightly colored digital flyer for the annual Harmony Creek Summer Block Party, which had happened about a month ago. The flyer was full of cheerful clip art and bubbly fonts, and at the bottom, a single, proud sentence. Street closure for our cul-de-sac has been approved by the city for your safety and enjoyment. A light bulb didn't just go on in my head. A whole damn chandelier lit up. Street closure approved. By whom? For what, exactly? My fingers flew across the keyboard. I went straight to the city's public records portal, my heart starting to pound a heavy rhythm against my ribs. I typed in my street name and searched for active and recent permits. And there it was, a single PDF file. Temporary Street Use Permit. Permit number 77B4Q. I clicked it. I downloaded it. I opened it. And I saw the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was an official document from the city's Department of Transportation. It was a permit to close our cul-de-sac for 24 hours for the block party. I scrolled down to the box marked Permit Holder, Responsible Party. And there, in black and white, was the name. Carol, on behalf of Harmony Creek HOA. This was the thread. The loose thread that Sergeant Miller had told me to find. I started pulling. I read the fine print, my eyes devouring the dense legalese. My pulse quickened. The permit holder, it stated, assumes all responsibility for traffic control, access, and liability for the duration of the permit. The rules were strict and explicit. The permit holder must ensure clear and legal access for all residents' vehicles at all times, unless the vehicle itself is blocking the event. Any towing for any reason must be pre-approved by a DOT official and must follow city and state law, which, and this was the glorious part, superseded any private agreements, such as HOA bylaws. Carol had used her HOA authority to tow me, but if the permit was active, I scrolled to the top of the document, looking for the valid dates. For a simple 24-hour event, the city, in its infinite bureaucratic wisdom, issued a standard 30-day permit to allow for planning, setup, and cleanup. The block party was 3.5 weeks ago. I checked the permit status on the city portal. I expected it to be listed as expired or closed. It wasn't. It was listed as active. Carol, in her sloppiness and arrogance, had filed the paperwork to get the power, but she had never formally closed the permit out. The breath caught in my throat. I stood up from my chair and began to pace around the room, a giddy, manic energy surging through me. She hadn't just towed my vans as an HOA president. She had towed them as the legally designated, DOT-sanctioned traffic manager of our street. She had used the power of the state, granted to her by this permit, to settle a petty grudge. And in doing so, she hadn't just broken her own stupid little HOA rules. She had broken the law. She had flown too close to the sun, on wings made of hubris and clipboard paper. I sat back down at my computer, my hands steady. I lined up my evidence in a series of browser tabs: the active permit PDF, the vulture towing receipt with the fraudulent Directive 11B, the audio file of my conversation with Carol where she admitted everything, and a half-dozen photos of Florence and Nightingale parked legally and peacefully on the street from the day before. I picked up my phone. I had found my great white shark. It was time to feed it. I took a deep, steadying breath and dialed the number for the city's Department of Transportation. I felt a strange sense of calm, the kind you feel when you know you're holding a royal flush. A woman with a voice so monotone it could have been computer-generated answered. Department of Transportation? This is Brenda. Hello, Brenda, I said, keeping my own voice level and professional. My name is Leo, and I'm calling about a potential misuse of a street permit. The permit number is 77B4Q. Okay, Brenda said, the single word conveying a universe of boredom. What about it? I could hear the telltale clacking of a keyboard in the background. Well, Brenda, it appears the permit holder has used her authority under this active permit to have 2 of my vehicles illegally towed from a public street this morning. The clacking stopped. Come again? The permit holder cited an internal HOA rule as justification for the tow, I continued, pressing my advantage. But the fine print of the permit she holds clearly states that DOT regulations supersede any private agreements, and that any tow must be authorized by a DOT official. I can assure you, no DOT official was consulted. There was a moment of silence on the other end. The boredom in Brenda's voice was gone, replaced by a distinct flicker of interest. Wait a minute. You're saying she used an active DOT closure permit to authorize a private tow? For a non-emergency vehicle that wasn't blocking anything? That's correct, I said, a small smile playing on my lips. She basically declared herself queen of the street and had my personal property seized. I have the tow receipt, photos, and a recording of the permit holder admitting she did it because my vans were an eyesore. Brenda's tone shifted dramatically. There was a spark in it now. The sound of a bureaucrat who has just stumbled upon a rare and flagrant violation, the administrative equivalent of finding a unicorn. Sir, can you please hold for one moment? I need to get my supervisor. I was put on hold, but it wasn't the usual dead air or terrible music. I could hear muffled, excited talking in the background. I heard words like unbelievable, flagrant misuse, and get a truck ready. A minute later, a new voice came on the line. It was crisp, female, and radiated pure, no-nonsense authority. Sir, this is Maria Rodriguez. I'm a supervisor here at the DOT. Brenda has briefed me on the situation. Could you please walk me through it one more time? I laid out the entire story for Miss Rodriguez. I told her about Carol, the HOA, the vans, the fake directive, and the active permit. She listened intently, interrupting only to ask sharp, specific questions. What is the name of the towing company? Vulture Towing and Recovery. I heard her snort in derision. And you have a recording of the permit holder, Miss Carol, admitting this? Yes, ma'am. And the permit, 77B4Q, is still active in our system. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. She had already looked it up. Sir, would it be possible for you to email me all of the evidence you have? The permit, the receipt, the photos, the audio file? Email it to me right now." "Absolutely," I said. "It's all ready to go." "Good," she said, and her voice was now cold and hard as steel. "You've been very helpful. I believe we have everything we need to take immediate action. Thank you for bringing this to our attention." The line went dead. I leaned back in my chair, my heart thumping. Immediate action. I liked the sound of that. I quickly composed an email to Miss Rodriguez, attached all my files, and hit send. I looked at the clock on my computer screen. It was 11:15 a.m. I went to the kitchen to pour myself another cup of coffee. The righteous adrenaline making my hands tremble slightly, I walked over to my living room window, which had a perfect, unobstructed view of the cul-de-sac, and more importantly, of Carol's house directly across the street. I didn't have to wait long. At 11:20 a.m., not 5 minutes after I had hung up the phone, a gleaming white Ford F-150 with a prominent City Department of Transportation seal on its side and a single, flashing yellow light on its roof whipped into our quiet cul-de-sac. It didn't slow down. It drove with a purpose, bypassing my house and pulling to an abrupt, authoritative stop directly in front of Carol's house, parking in the exact spot where her "Don't even think about parking here" sign stood. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped a woman in a high-visibility yellow vest, holding a tablet computer. It was Miss Rodriguez. She was even more formidable in person. She strode up Carol's pristine walkway with a gait that suggested she regularly kicked down doors for a living. At that exact moment, as if orchestrated by the universe for my personal enjoyment, Carol herself came out her front door. She was holding a small watering can, presumably on her way to tend to her prize-winning petunias, the very same petunias she'd claimed my vans were blocking the precious morning sun from. She saw Miss Rodriguez approaching and put on her welcoming, presidential smile. From my window, I had a perfect view of the beautiful, beautiful carnage. "Can I help you?" Carol chirped, her smile unwavering. Miss Rodriguez didn't smile back. She tapped the screen of her tablet. "Are you Carol, the listed holder for Public Street Permit 77B4Q? Carol's smile widened. She thought this was a friend. "I am. It was for our annual block party, though that was last month. Everything was a great success. The city was so helpful." "That permit is still active in our system," Miss Rodriguez stated, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "Which means you are currently the person legally responsible for all traffic management on this public street. And it has come to our attention that this morning you used the authority granted to you by this permit to have 2 privately owned vehicles towed. Is that correct?" The smile on Carol's face didn't just falter, it collapsed. The color drained from her cheeks. "Well, yes. But they were in violation of HOA." "I don't care about your HOA," Miss Rodriguez cut her off, her voice sharp as broken glass. "I care about the municipal code. You authorized a private tow from a public street using a public permit in direct violation of Title 14, Section 225 of the city's transportation statutes. That is a serious offense." I don't understand," Carol stammered, the watering can dangling forgotten from her hand. "Let me make it plain for you," Miss Rodriguez said, stepping closer. "Effective immediately, your permit is revoked. Furthermore, you, Carol, are personally barred from applying for any street permits of any kind within city limits for a period of 5 years. Carol's jaw dropped. "You can't do that. I am the HOA president. I have a duty." "Ma'am, right now, you are the subject of a formal DOT investigation for permit misuse," Miss Rodriguez said, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm level. "We will also be filing a formal complaint and referring the tow company you used, Vulture Towing, to the state licensing board for their part in this illegal seizure. You can expect a certified letter from the city detailing your personal fines within the week. I trust you'll find that clear enough. Have a nice day." Miss Rodriguez turned on her heel, her duty done. She strode back to her truck without a backward glance, got in, and drove away. The single yellow light still flashing, a beacon of swift, bureaucratic justice. Carol was left standing alone in the middle of her perfect lawn, her face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock and horror. The watering can slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the concrete path. My gossipy neighbor was peeking through her blinds, her phone no doubt already active. Across the street, Dave, who had come out to get his mail, caught my eye. He gave me a slow, epic, triumphant fist pump. I took a long, satisfying sip of my coffee. It was the best I'd ever tasted. The karmic dominoes, having been given a firm shove by Miss Rodriguez, began to fall with spectacular speed. The shockwave from the DOT's surgical strike rippled through Harmony Creek, and my life, almost instantly. My phone rang not 10 minutes after the DOT truck had left. The caller ID read, "Vulture Towing and Recovery." I answered, putting on my most cheerful voice. "Leo speaking." The voice on the other end was no longer bored or dismissive. It was panicked. It was the voice of a man who had just had a conversation with a state licensing board. "Mr. Leo, sir. This is Ron, the manager at Vulture Towing. There has been a terrible, terrible misunderstanding regarding your vehicles this morning." "Oh, really?" I said, swirling the coffee in my mug. "Seemed pretty straightforward to me. You towed them, you charged me over $2,000. What's to misunderstand?" No, sir, that was a clerical error. A mistake by one of our newer dispatchers," he blabbered. "The HOA authorization wasn't properly vetted. We are so sorry for the inconvenience. We are on our way to your location right now to return your vehicles. At no charge, of course. Absolutely no charge." "That's very good of you, Ron," I said. "And we'd like to offer you a full complimentary detail inside and out for both vans," he continued, his voice thick with desperation. "And we'll fill up both of their gas tanks, as a token of our profound apology for the mix-up." "Well, Ron," I said, savoring the moment, "seeing as how you've been so reasonable, I accept your apology." An hour later, a massive Vulture Towing flatbed truck, not the greasy repo truck from this morning, rolled into the cul-de-sac. It handled my vans with the gentle care of a surgeon. Florence and Nightingale were placed back in their rightful spots on the street, looking shinier than they had in months. The neighborhood kids, sensing an event, had gathered on the sidewalk to watch, cheering as Nightingale's tires touched the pavement. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Frank the contractor. "Frank, holy crap, I heard what happened. It's all over the neighborhood Facebook page. Karen got nuked from orbit, so do we cancel the Gnome Army?" I chuckled and typed back. "Me. Stand down the troops, General Frank. The war is over. We won." Frank. Damn. And I'd just found a gnome that looked exactly like her. Well, if you ever need to build a spite fence, you know who to call. That weekend, an emergency HOA meeting was called via a flurry of panicked emails. I attended, of course. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. I sat in the back of the community clubhouse, sipping a bottle of water, just another face in the crowd. The room was buzzing. Carol was conspicuously absent. Dave told me she hadn't left her house in 3 days. A grim-faced man from the HOA's management company ran the meeting. He announced that, due to recent events that had exposed the HOA to significant legal and financial liability, Carol had tendered her resignation as president, effective immediately. A new election was required. After a moment of silence, a woman from the next street over stood up. "I nominate Leo," she said, pointing at me. "He's the one who stood up to her." A few people clapped. My blood ran cold. This was not part of the plan. I stood up quickly. Wow, I want to thank you for the honor. I really do," I said, trying to sound gracious and not terrified. but I must respectfully, emphatically, and with every fiber of my being decline. Being your president sounds like a truly thankless and terrible job. However, I added, seeing my opportunity, I do have a counter-nomination. A man of the people. A man who understands the importance of compliant shadows. I nominate my neighbor Dave. Dave, who had been trying to shrink into his chair, shot me a look of pure betrayal. But the crowd loved it. He was elected by a landslide. His first official act as the new HOA president was to propose a new bylaw. "I move," he announced, "that no member of this community shall ever be fined for a shadow, a welcome mat, or a dandelion. All in favor?" A chorus of ayes filled the room. The reign of terror was over. A week later, life in Harmony Creek felt, well, harmonious. I was sitting on my porch in the late afternoon sun, watching Florence and Nightingale gleam at the curb. They looked like sentinels, guardians of our new, slightly less uptight suburban peace. Dave jogged by and gave me a thumbs up. The kids next door were playing basketball, their hoop casting a long, beautiful, non-compliant shadow across the asphalt. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Frank. There was no message, just a picture. It was a single garden gnome, standing in what looked like Frank's workshop. It was wearing a tiny hand-painted pink tracksuit and a visor. It had a furious expression on its face, and its little ceramic hand was raised, defiantly giving the middle finger to the world. I laughed out loud, a real, genuine laugh. I took a sip of my beer and leaned back in my chair, finally at peace. Across the street, two men were hammering a large wooden sign into Carol's perfect lawn. It was red and white, and the words on it were simple: "For sale."